panic is the correct initial response, because in some ways you have to assume the worst. But as data becomes available, as for example, you learn more about what it is you're facing and its medical prognosis and so on, surely you should adapt, maybe scale the panic back or work out what is working and what is not.
If I said something at the executive, it was a headline the next morning in the paper, do you know what I mean? So it was a horrendous time.
Well, hello. We've now got an in-conversation session, which is a bit like, for those of you who are old enough to remember, the Michael Parkinson-style interview. I'm going to be chatting with Arlene Foster, who's a Northern Irish broadcaster and politician. She was the former First Minister in the Northern Ireland devolved government and also the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, the first woman to hold either of those positions as a matter of interest. And she's now currently with GB News. And as First Minister during the time of the pandemic, Arlene, you had, if you like, a ringside seat of the processes of the governmental response to this, well, not unprecedented, but rather for many people surprising medical challenge and emergency. And I know that you're very concerned with the costs, the hidden costs, if you will, of the responses that governments made to this challenge, and also the way in which those costs were shared out and borne. So if you perhaps could say, what do you think those costs really were, these hidden costs that we're only now perhaps coming to terms with, and how and why do you think they're unequally shared out?
Sure, so really good to be here and to reflect on this past 2 years. I looked back at my notes because it's always important to make notes when there's going to be a public inquiry. So I looked back at my notes of my very first COBRA meeting, and there in black and white was the phrase, "Follow the science." And we all heard that phrase, didn't we, so many times from our politicians, and the fact that we had to do what the science was telling us to do. But at that very first meeting, there was no mention of what it would do to our economy, what it would do to the education and life chances of our young people. I think there was a complete panic and fear at that time because we'd seen the images from Italy and what was happening in the hospitals in Italy, and the fact that people were being piled up. It was really horrendous, and the predictions and the modelling that was being given to us as politicians from scientists was really very scary, I have to say, at that particular point in time. So therefore, we came to the position that we found ourselves in, which was to lock down the entire country. And you remember that first lockdown, it was so well adhered to. I live in quite a rural part of Northern Ireland, but I live off a main road, and I could have stood in the middle of the main road for an hour and there wouldn't have been a car down it. So the first lockdown was so well adhered to, schools closed, everybody in their homes, nobody mixing socially. But there was no conversation about not even the long-term harms that were coming down the road, but the short-term harms that were there as well. For vulnerable children, for example, if you were an autistic child and you were used to going to school and having a routine, that was all disrupted, and that had an impact then, of course, not just on the children, but in the entire family. So there was no conversation about that, either in the Northern Ireland government or indeed wider either. But I think the alarming thing is, you remember at the time it was all about trying to protect the NHS and make sure that there was enough capacity to deal with what was coming towards us. And that's fine, that was the point in time that we were at. But as time went on, there didn't seem to be a building up of resilience or even a learning curve of, should we be doing something different as we went along? And I think that's the critical point. Because we just kept doing the lockdowns. And I remember saying in Northern Ireland, we should be learning to live with the virus. And when we tried to do something different, oh my goodness, the opprobrium that was heaped upon us for trying to do something different was very real, mainly from the media, I have to say, because they were saying, if you don't lock down, people are going to die. And it was a very scary time.
Yes, and that raises several interesting points, really. I mean, one of them is the role that the media played and why they had such an effect. And another is exactly why it was that our hospital systems, not just in Northern Ireland or the UK, but I think across the whole of Europe and many parts of the world, proved unable to cope with a serious epidemic when I'm old enough to remember the Hong Kong flu pandemic of 1968-69 when they did cope with it. So, and as you say, they didn't get resilient. So why do you think that was? I mean, have you got any idea about why that might be?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in health policy, and I don't pretend to be. But certainly, I could understand why we did what we did back in March of 2020, because we needed to protect people. And if that was a short-term issue, then that was fine. I think the difficulty was we continued to do that for almost 2 years. And that has had, and when we talk about unseen harms, that has had such an impact, I believe, on young people, particularly those going through their exam years, those years where they were getting end of year. I mean, it may sound like a very small thing, but rites of passage, you know, leaving school, doing all the things that you should be doing when you are leaving school. The fact that life chances were stunted, the fact that people's confidence, young people's confidence was hit in that way. But also, of course, women had to bear the burden of a lot of the caring responsibilities, the homeschooling, the fact that many women are in low-paid jobs and they had to deal with all of those things. And our elderly people, because of course it's our elderly people who we really did have to protect. You remember the whole issue of if you do this, then Granny's going to die. Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole issue of protecting our elderly people should have been dealt with in a more targeted way, I feel. And therefore we could have protected them in a better way instead of this blanket approach that everybody had to do it.
Well, I mean, it seems to me there's an interesting point you make there is that I would argue myself that when you're confronted with a pandemic, the panic is the correct initial response because in some ways you have to assume the worst. But as data becomes available, as for example, you learn more about what it is you're facing and its medical prognosis and so on, surely you should adapt, maybe scale the panic back or work out what is working and what is not. So clearly, from what you say, that's what didn't happen. Now, what part do you think the media played in that failure of perhaps the administrative and political process to adjust responses as we went along?
Oh, I think they played a huge part in it because, as I say, we tried to... In Northern Ireland, we have a mandatory coalition with 5 political parties, ranging from left of centre to right of centre. And, well, when I say left of centre, probably way left of centre, to be fair, when I talk about Sinn Féin. But we were confronted with this, and as you can imagine, those left of centre, state intervention people wanted to do more and more and more. And of course, those of us on the right of centre were very concerned about personal freedoms and personal responsibility. So we had very long meetings about what was the right thing to do. At one of those, we were trying to keep, you may laugh at this, Steve, actually, we were trying to keep coffee shops and close contact services, which is hairdressers, beauticians, open for a week longer. And the media reaction to that was incredible. We were going to kill people. And in the end, we weren't able to do that because the rest of the mandatory coalition pushed ahead that you know, we had to do it in that particular way. So the media played a huge role in how people react.
And that does sort of suggest in a way that the media has become the tail that's wagging the dog in some senses. Yes. I mean, I'm interested in your comments about the particular challenges you faced as, you know, First Minister in Northern Ireland and being part of the coalition there. So what light do you think the crisis and government response casts on the nature of the devolution settlement, if you will, more generally, not just in Northern Ireland, but... Yeah,
so that's a very good question, because I'm not sure whether everyone's aware that when the legislation first came about to deal with the pandemic, a lot of the powers were actually devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So whilst we were trying to deal with it on a UK-wide level, we would have had calls with Michael Gove, who was coordinating the UK-wide response. Obviously, Scotland, on many occasions, wanted to be ahead of what was happening in Westminster, just to make a political point, frankly, from my perspective. And instead of actually working together in concert, it became a bit of a political issue, which it shouldn't, of course, have become, but it was. And I mean, it was almost like, well, Wales is doing better than the rest of the UK. Oh, Northern Ireland's doing better than... And I mean, that's the sort of way it happened. And for us in Northern Ireland, of course, because Sinn Féin was in government, they were always looking to see what Dublin was doing. And of course, we had a land border with the Republic of Ireland, so that was an issue as well. So it was a very complicated piece, but all the while, and you mentioned the data and the analysis as we went through the pandemic, it became clear, and Public Health England have said, that those people who were over 80 were 70 times more likely, 70 times more likely to die than those under 40. So why were we continuing, the question I have, to just have a blanket approach to this instead of a more targeted approach? And you may say, well, why didn't you do that? You were in government at the time. And that's a very fair point. But the reality is I was in a mandatory coalition where we had to try and find consensus as to how to deal with the issue to move forward and not have a complete breakdown in terms of dealing with the pandemic.
Yes, and my final point really before we go to Q&A would be that in theory, having the devolved administrations and indeed the example of the Irish Republic close by would have been a way of finding out what worked from what didn't.
Yes.
But in practice, from what you're saying, it appears that it didn't work that way. It became a media-led competition and also politically driven competition to see who could be more in line with the consensus that had devolved in the media. Would you agree with that?
No, I would agree with that. And I think that's really regrettable because I do remember at some of the meetings we were trying to hear what was happening in Wales in terms of they were doing a pilot on, I think it was track and trace. Do you remember the whole track and trace scenario? And testing, so they would test a small, I think it was Merthyr Tydfil, they were all tested to see what was happening with the pandemic in that area and could we learn from that. But really, it got into a media frenzy, and as you can imagine in government, leaks are always so very helpful from cabinet and the executive, but we were just leaking like a sieve, frankly. So if I said something at the executive, it was a headline the next morning in the paper, do you know what I mean? So it was a horrendous time, and I just hope, and I mean, I've said to you, lessons certainly do need to be learned, because we listened to that brilliant lecture from Peter earlier on, and he was talking about how private sector organisations have to learn from their mistakes. Well, I mean, government has to very much learn from their mistakes. Otherwise, we are going to be interrupting, when the next pandemic comes around, personal freedoms again. And I think that is absolutely wrong. Obviously, we want to protect people. We want to give people information. We want them to know what their actions will mean. But surely people have a personal responsibility to look after themselves.
Well, that's my last question to you. What, if you were asked at an inquiry, as I suspect you probably will be, what lessons do you think would have been learned? What would you recommend, as a response in future pandemics? What would your answer be to that?
Well, there has to be a better process of getting information, not just from science. Of course, we needed to know how the pandemic was evolving, and the vaccine, which I think was a brilliant intervention, I have to say, from the UK, made possible by leaving the European Union, I have to say, and I think that is very important that we do say that. But we need to take into account economic harms, health harms, other health harms, and we all know of people who haven't been diagnosed for other things because they weren't able to get to their health providers. And of course, the education harms that took place as well. And all of that leading to worse health outcomes, some young people having mental health problems because of the isolation that they faced by not being able to go to school. All of those things have to be taken into account before we have another lockdown scenario again.
So in other words, better cost-benefit calculations, essentially.
Correct.
Well, thank you very much for that.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.